I wanted to say first and foremost, thank you to Breaking Convention for allowing a dangerous talk about unity, and also thank you for coming. I only have a half hour, so the Q&A portion of this talk will take place, where all Q&A should take place, down the block at the Ram Pub. If you have any questions after my talk, and I suspect you might, I am happy to oblige. It's just in the spirit of unity, I think we should share some pints while we do it. Admittedly, I am a little nervous. Actually, fuck it, let's be honest. I am scared shitless to give this talk right now because I'm going to share a lot of uncomfortable truths. But as my business partner and best friend Eden says, the very fact that not just me, but a lot of people are scared to say everything I'm about to say is exactly why it needs to be said. So be prepared. What I'm going to share is going to run counter to all of the lies we have been instructed to believe. These lies are promoted by the government and media. They trickle into society and rot from within our beautiful psychedelic renaissance. And now, I don't mean this in a rude way at all, but I should not have to tell a bunch of people who have taken LSD that your government and media are lying to you. So let's get right into it. Decolonization. I don't like colonization at all. That any group would force another group to live under constant threat of death if they do not incorporate alien customs into their lives, that does not sit right with me at all. So I am a big fan of decolonization. I believe that the various indigenous psychedelic practices should be protected and remain unmolested by any Western legal, medical, corporate, or religious influence. There are many ways to use these medicines, as we all know, and there is no reason to force a Western medical perspective on them. Western doctors have their methods, ayahuasqueras have their methods. The way I see it, both work. Both have value. Part of the turmoil between the various indigenous and Western medical models results from a fundamental misunderstanding of history that is commonly called the narrative. The narrative is that aspect of woke psychedelia that poisons otherwise good ideas like decolonization. Now, the narrative can be expressed in any number of ways, but they all boil down to the same point. Namely, all Europeans and their descendants, 100% of the time, are evil Western colonizers, and all non-European peoples and their descendants, 100% of the time, are innocent victims. Now, I'm not saying that all of you believe that. I'm just saying that that is the narrative found throughout popular culture, news, movies, politics. You all know what I'm talking about. The narrative is why in psychedelia we are not allowed to discuss the crimes against humanity of non-European peoples. And yet, indigenous peoples certainly colonized, raped, pillaged, murdered, enslaved, and stole land from other indigenous groups before any European ever stepped foot in the Americas. Now, you blokes don't deal with this, and blokettes, pardon me, but in my country, we are often told to give the land back. And you know, this might be not a bad idea. I'm actually kind of in favor of it. I'm just a little confused as to who we should give the land back to. So, for example, if we were to give a part of Texas back, the great state of Texas, to the last indigenous group that lived there, well, we would give it to the Apache, right? But the Apache stole the land from the Comanche. So who do we give it back to, the Apache or the Comanche? If we give it back to the Apache, we would be giving the land back to murdering, enslaving, colonizing peoples. So we should give it back to the Comanche, right? Well, there's a problem with that. You see, earlier, the Comanche had invaded, enslaved, and stolen the land from the Pueblo peoples, who earlier had invaded, colonized, enslaved, taken the land from the Plainview peoples, who earlier had invaded, enslaved, and stolen the land from the Folsom people. So when you say give the land back, I'm just a little curious. What murdering, enslaving, colonizing indigenous group are you talking about, specifically? Let me be clear, I am most certainly not defending the horrific genocides, land grabs, and marginalization of indigenous peoples. I'm just saying that life and history are a little too complicated for this narrative. Okay, and I'm all in favor of platforming indigenous voices. My group is throwing a conference this summer. I'm not even speaking at it so that an indigenous woman can speak instead, because we all should be doing that. That's a good thing. I just don't see why we have to shit all over Western civilization in the process. So, critical race theorist Ibram Kendi, who unfortunately shares similar ideas as some of the authors found in this book, says that the only way to correct for past discrimination is to create present discrimination. So, to correct for past injustice, let's create injustice today. I'm going to let that sit for a second, because you're not misreading it and you are correct. This is psychopathic. But I like to keep an open mind, so let's see how this psychopathic philosophy would play out in the psychedelic renaissance today. Dr. Monica Williams writes in Psychedelic Justice that the Zulu people of Africa employed ubalawu, and I apologize if I just butchered that, a psychoactive spiritual medicine to communicate with their ancestors and treat mental disturbances. What Dr. Williams doesn't tell us is that the Zulu was a slave-driving force in Africa. They consider non-Zulu peoples like the Sothos to be wild beasts and discriminate against them due to nothing more than their skin color, which they say looks like a cracked clay pot. Really nasty stuff. So, by the rules of social justice that seek to correct for the past, exactly what present injustices shall we inflict upon the Zulu people today? Aztec priests' mushroom rituals involved ripping the still beating hearts out of their slaves during their coronation ceremonies. Shall we today enslave the people of Mexico and rip out their hearts every time we have an election? You know, to correct for this past injustice, of course, right? I don't want to do that. I would rather carry on my European ancestors' psychedelic traditions, which mostly involve just taking drugs and fucking each other, which is a lot more fun than murdering people. Now, none of this is meant to justify colonization or the terrible ways indigenous peoples were treated by first Europeans and then Americans, which is deplorable. I am sharing these harsh truths not to provoke, but rather to point to the subject of unity in the subtitle of this speech. Perhaps instead of thinking of clever ways to create injustice today, as woke people recommend, we reflect on the history of human evils and see the horrible commonality of it all. And anyway, how exactly does creating injustice today retroactively fix the past? And really, is this what we want our psychedelic renaissance to be? Hurting people? I thought we were harm reductionists. And now I don't have time to get into the Chippewa, so instead we're going to talk about the most important thing in the entire universe: gender. At a psychedelic conference in Canada last year, Dr. Philip Lucas outlined a rather extraordinary study for measuring psychedelic experiences. It was fascinating. I absorbed his words with great enthusiasm until he said something really odd. He said we need to account for the fact that his conclusions come from a cisgender white man. Whatever that is. Okay, I was immediately confused because, as you can see, I am a white man. And I have absolutely no idea what a white male perspective is. Seriously, what is that? And thinking about it, if there's a white male perspective, there must also be a black male perspective. And I got to tell you, this woke idea that people of similar races and gender identities all share the same worldview is narrow-minded at best and really racist at worst. Puzzled by Dr. Lucas's words, I approached him after his talk and asked him why he felt the need to include that bit about being a cisgender white male. Dr. Lucas responded, so that everyone knows my conclusions come from a privileged perspective. Whatever the fuck that means. Still confused, I asked, no, I mean, what do your immutable characteristics have to do with the excellent study you just presented for us? Dr. Lucas merely repeated himself, so that everyone knows my conclusions come from a privileged perspective. Dr. Lucas, I said, You asked volunteers from all walks of life to participate in your study. Those people answered questionnaires relating to their psychedelic experiences. You collected those questionnaires, tallied the numbers, and created charts and graphs to demonstrate the statistics. So we're talking about math here. What do race and gender have to do with math? Would the numbers be different if you were a transgender Middle Eastern woman? Is your study viable or not? Well, now it was Dr. Lucas's turn to be confused. He stared at me for a few seconds, said it was nice to meet you, shook my hand, and walked away. Canadians, am I right? Look, I'm totally fine with whatever gender identity you claim for yourself, okay? I say live your authentic self. Do it. Look, I had to hide the fact that I was gay for most of my life. I don't want anybody to suffer that. I don't. And Dr. Lucas is very smart and very kind, so I don't want to paint an inaccurate picture of him. He's a really great guy. And this wasn't really even his fault. He was just repeating the narrative. His statement was an apology. He was apologizing for his immutable characteristics, which have what to do with math? I still don't know. And speaking of math, I know I'm stepping on a hornet's nest with this one, but if you care about Black lives as I do, then I invite you to recall my earlier caveat and listen very carefully, because everything I'm about to say is going to cut against everything we have all been instructed to believe. First, we need to separate the idea from the movement. Of course, Black lives matter. Of course they do. Okay? I'm a big fan of that idea. I'm not a big fan of the movement, however, and I'll explain why in a moment. In Psychedelic Justice, doctors Bill Labate and Nicole Buchanan write with disapproval that some people do not agree with the BLM narrative. They say that it is unacceptable that anyone deny that structural racism exists in the U.S. These deniers attribute racist incidents, specifically the high occurrence of police killing Black people, to either rogue cops or dysfunctional Black communities and Black culture. Now look, I understand that BLM grew out of a sincere belief that police officers were eagerly targeting unarmed Black men in the streets. I used to believe that myself, so I don't fault anybody who thinks that. Our news media has manipulated all of us into believing it's true. This media manipulation gets filtered into otherwise excellent books like Dr. Carl Hart's Drug Use for Grown-Ups, wherein Dr. Hart mentions Ramarley Graham, who was killed by the police because they believed he had a gun he did not possess. It's a horrible tragedy. Well, likewise, officers in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, killed a white guy, a 50-year-old white guy named Jeffrey Tavis, for the same reason. They thought he had a gun he did not possess. Is that not also a horrible tragedy? Dr. Hart also mentions the shooting of Rumain Brisbane. Simply compare Brisbane's case to that of a white 20-year-old kid named William Lamont. A white police officer shot Rumain Brisbane because he thought Brisbane was pulling a weapon from his waistband. A Black police officer shot William Lamont for the same reason. Does anybody here remember the name of, I can't remember, he died very recently, just a few years ago, because this racist piece of shit cop was jamming his knee into the guy's neck, and even though he screamed he couldn't breathe, the cop wouldn't let up. What was that guy's name? George Floyd. Wrong. Well, you're right technically, but that's not who I'm talking about. No, I'm talking about Tony Timpa, a white guy who died the same way George Floyd died, suffocated to death by a police officer driving his knee into his neck. That's the knee right there that killed him. While Timpa screamed out that he was dying more than 30 times, the officers laughed at him as they slowly squeezed the last breath of Tony Timpa's life away. Say his name? I invite Dr. Hart or anyone else to check the crime reports themselves. For every example of an unarmed Black person needlessly dying by police hands, there is a white counterpart who perished under the same circumstances that did not make national headlines. Let's look at some numbers. 2020 ended with 1,020 police shootings, the majority of whom were threatening the officer or another person in a deadly manner. 457 of them were white. 243, so half, were black. Of the 457 white people shot by the police, 24 were unarmed. Of the 243 black people shot by the police, 18 were unarmed. In Psychedelic Justice, Doctors Bia Labate and Nicole Buchanan write of the police killings of countless other black children. If anybody knows Doctors Labate and Buchanan, please pass along this message for me. Between 2020 and 2021, 35 children were killed. 2 of them were burnt alive, not a single one killed by the police. Everyone was murdered through gang violence. Each of them, the majority were black, each of whom had a life that mattered. You see, you don't have to know what you're talking about or do 5 minutes of research. You just have to repeat the narrative, and then you can say whatever nonsense you want. And let me be clear. I'm not discounting a police officer's murder of unarmed black men. I'm not doing that at all. I'm saying we need to come together as a unified psychedelic renaissance and stand up against police brutality as one voice. Now, a counterclaim is often made that since the white population in the US is around 76% and the black population around 13%, there's a major numerical imbalance between the races, and when we adjust for that discrepancy, it is shown that more black people are shot by the police. Well, this is a fantastic misunderstanding of how statistics work. This is symposia-style statistics. The correct metric to use is not raw population numbers, but rather the number of high-risk encounters between the police and civilians. Well, the reason is fairly obvious. Well, not to woke people, but to others, it's pretty obvious. Right now, there are millions of both black and white people who are unlikely to see the business end of a police officer's firearm. For example, like adolescent and teenage girls and the elderly. They are all counted in the raw population number, yet they are unlikely to end up in a violent encounter with police, making raw population numbers a flawed statistical benchmark. The rhetoric that black people are being hunted down by the police has caused what has been called the Ferguson effect. Here's what it looks like. A perpetrator was smashing a female officer's head into the concrete. She took this deadly abuse because she feared being called a racist if she pulled out her gun and defended herself. The Ferguson effect has led police to back off from patrolling high-crime neighborhoods, exactly where they are needed the most, because they fear becoming the next media circus racist exiled from society, even if they are trying to save their own lives or the life of an innocent victim. This is resulting in more murders in predominantly black neighborhoods. If the BLM narrative were true, we would have seen a drop-off in black homicide victims as police stopped controlling high-crime areas. Instead, we are seeing a heartbreaking increase. How will anyone from Chacruna Institute or Symposia explain that? But these are just numbers. Let's put some faces to it. I skipped quite a bit, excuse me. Harvard economist Roland Fryer examined 5 U.S. cities and found that since the inception of Black Lives Matter, an additional 2,500 homicides on the low end and as many as 10,000 homicides on the high end. The medium number, a staggering 8,000 more deaths of young black men as a direct result of BLM rhetoric supported by Chacruna Institute and Symposia and resulting in the inevitable Ferguson effect. For each of these murders, there are thousands of their survivors thrown into a spiral of depression and trauma. And as I've said before, these are just numbers, and we're going to put some faces to it now. During one BLM riot, Raekwon Borum shot Justin Carr in the head. No outcry, no call to stop the riots, no marches for justice, race hustlers nowhere to be found. Justin Carr's life mattered. It mattered. But I doubt anybody from Chacruna, Symposia, or otherwise has ever even heard of him. Because this doesn't fit the narrative. Or how about Marcus Johnson? During one wave of BLM in 2015, he was killed in a drive-by shooting. He was 6. You also won't hear about a certain Carolyn Sweeper, a 93-year-old amputee who until recently was living in the Bronx, New York. I spoke to her son the other day and found out she recently passed away, and out of respect for his wishes, I'm not including a photo of her. When she was alive, she had to wait for the police to show up just to go to her mailbox to get her mail. You see, the hallways in her building were not safe for a woman of any age. Any of you live like that? I don't. You think anyone from Symposia lives like that? I doubt it. Carolyn Sweeper loved the police because she lived like that. Carolyn Sweeper wanted more police in her neighborhood because, unlike all of us, she dealt with gang violence every goddamn day. But I doubt anyone from Chacruna Institute, Symposia, or otherwise has ever even heard of her. And it's not their fault. It's not their fault. See, Miss Sweeper she doesn't fit the narrative. So she's cast aside by the media and silenced. And yet I believe that Carolyn Sweeper and thousands of other victims of inner city violence just like her deserve the same safety and peace of mind that every one of us takes for granted. Carolyn Sweeper's life mattered. I mean no disrespect to Bia Labate, but she is obviously too detached from the realities of inner city life. And let me be clear, I know Dr. Labate cares about Black lives. I know she does. So do I. We need to stand shoulder to shoulder on this, and I am pleading with her and everybody else to do so. We are all being played by a dishonest media that uses selective reporting of these tragedies to create a bogus narrative about race so that we will all stay divided and clicking on their bullshit articles. And if you haven't noticed, it's great for getting votes too. And of the BLM movement, here's how much they care about our Black sisters and brothers who are the legit victims of police violence. Reverend Jerry McAfee comments, BLM collected some $30 million off the death of George Floyd, and they've put not $1 in our community. He is echoed by Reverend T. Cherie Dickerson, founder of the Oklahoma BLM chapter. The families are feeling exploited, their pain exploited. And that's not something I ever want to be affiliated with. Patrisse Cullors, co-founder of Black Lives Matter, stepped down from her more privileged than most white people will ever be position in May 2021 amid questions about BLMs and her personal finances. So she ran away. Like innocent people do, of course. Now, I don't have time to get into the nature of her crimes, but Eden and I also run a nonprofit, and let me tell you, if we would have done just one of the things this woman did, we'd be in prison right now. Let's revisit Dr. Labate and Nicole Buchanan's earlier claim and see where there's room for agreement and disagreement. Structural racism has certainly played a role in creating this mess in the inner cities. Laws in my country were specifically written to abuse Black men, dishonor Black women, and marginalize Black children. That is true, and it is repulsive. But the numbers do not lie. If structural racism played a role in the 1,376 Black men shot by the police between 2017 and today, then it also played a role in the 2,545 white men shot by the police during that same period. And of those few innocent victims who are legit victims of police brutality, both Black and white, they actually average about 2 or 3 every few years. I say they're all tragedies. I say every single one of their lives mattered. What do you say? And yes, there is still a tiny, pathetic minority of racist people in the United States. We don't celebrate these people. We don't platform them. We mock them. We punch them. We spit on them. We fart in their faces. Well, I did that once. I farted in this racist guy's face. It was awesome. Black intellectuals, President Obama, and even the smartest man in the world, Don Lemon, agree that the problem stems not from structural racism, but from absentee fathers, which hovers around 72%. Structural racism does not cause any man of any race to impregnate a woman and then leave her. And this is a problem in the white community too, okay, which is the illegitimacy rate is 40%. This crisis is not about race. It's about fathers abandoning their children. And we should all agree on this, right? Children need fathers. It's a lack of the divine masculine that cuts across races. That's the problem. Since a broader, and let's be honest, basic understanding of history and statistics shows this divisive narrative to be totally false, should we really allow it to tear us apart? We need competent and compassionate people like Bia Labate and Dr. Hart to do the right thing, stop unwittingly promoting false and deadly ideas until they can marshal any credible evidence whatsoever that what I'm saying is wrong. I offer a friendly invitation to either Dr. Labate, Hart, or anybody else to have a civil discussion on these issues, because getting these questions right is crucial and these conversations are long overdue. You know, we always hear that white people are scared to talk about race. I'm not scared to talk about race. I'll talk about race with anybody. It's the woke person's childish, temper tantrum-filled reaction to the truth that has people afraid. And the truth is, we cannot help kids struggling in the inner city, the most marginalized victims of white supremacy, if we are asking the wrong questions, ignoring the real problems, and chasing phantoms of a bygone era. We need to develop strategies that focus on the inner cities, and I'm happy to hear that some people are already doing this. If you know any of these people, please put me in touch with them. I would love to collaborate on this. Because, come on, certainly not all, but some of these kids really need the medicine. They need it. The problem with woke ideologies is that there is no room for nuance, facts, statistics, logic, or any other tried and true way of measuring social phenomena. As John McWhorter notes, we have become a nation of smart people attesting that they get it while peeing themselves. We cannot reach a common understanding as a unified psychedelic renaissance if we truly believe that all Europeans and their descendants want to westernize indigenous medicines and are uncaring about the struggles of indigenous peoples. We cannot develop tools to help people struggling with mental health issues if we think gender has anything to do with math. We cannot come together if those of us who are trying to identify and fix problems are accused of white-splaining and are called white supremacists. All right, this is really easy. Just like microaggressions, the wage gap, reptilian overlords, and mushrooms in Christian art, there's no such thing as white-splaining. No such thing. And the whole thing with calling people white supremacists, this is so stupid. Generally speaking, white supremacists do not care about black kids dying in the inner city. I do, as I'm sure many of you do as well. Outside our beautiful psychedelic renaissance, there is a whole world of people interested in these medicines, eager to hear what we all in this room and at this conference and beyond have to say. I urge us to promote growth, understanding, compassion, some hard truths, and above all, goodwill. We are doomed to fail if, first, we are promoting false accusations of uncaring racism, and second, if we are not allowed to question anything. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm happy to take your questions over down the block at the pub. Let's unify the psychedelic renaissance so we can set an example to be followed for the rest of the world. Cheers.